Number 1. Andrea Yates, the drowning of 5 children in a bathtub on June 20, 2001, in Clear Lake, Texas. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born on July 2, 1964, in Houston, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a Roman Catholic family that valued faith, discipline, and traditional gender roles. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, completed a 2-year pre-nursing program at the University of Texas, and earned a nursing degree from the University of Texas Health Science Center, working as a registered nurse at MD Anderson Cancer Center before meeting Rusty Yates at her apartment complex swimming pool in 1989. The couple married on April 17, 1993, and Andrea quickly became pregnant with their first child, Noah, born in February 1994, followed by John in December 1995, Paul in September 1997, Luke in February 1999, and Mary in November 2000. What appeared from the outside to be the perfect Christian family living in a modest 4-bedroom home in a Houston suburb concealed a devastating spiral of untreated mental illness that would culminate in one of the most horrific cases of filicide in American history. Andrea's first suicide attempt came in June 1999, when she tried to overdose on pills in the bathroom while her mother-in-law was visiting, an incident that resulted in her first hospitalization at Devereux, Texas Treatment Network, where she received a diagnosis of major depressive disorder with psychotic features. She was prescribed Haldol, an antipsychotic medication, and appeared to improve, but her psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, would later reduce her medication regimen after she reported feeling better, a decision that would prove catastrophic. Andrea became pregnant with her 5th child despite warnings from medical professionals that another pregnancy could trigger a severe psychotic episode, and indeed, after Mary's birth in November 2000, her mental health deteriorated rapidly. She stopped eating, became catatonic, scratched her head compulsively until it bled, and filled notebooks with disturbing religious delusions, writing that she was a bad mother who was corrupting her children and that death would be preferable to allowing them to burn in hell for eternity. On March 12, 2001, Andrea's father died, triggering another devastating collapse, and she was hospitalized again at Devereux, where psychiatrist Dr. Saeed discontinued her antipsychotic medication entirely and switched her to Effexor, an antidepressant, despite her clearly psychotic symptoms including visions, voices, and elaborate delusions about Satan and the apocalypse. She was released on March 28, 2001, with instructions for outpatient follow-up that Rusty Yates would later describe as inadequate, and for the next 3 months, Andrea's condition oscillated between moments of apparent normalcy and frightening episodes of complete detachment from reality. On June 18, 2001, Dr. Saeed's partner, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, visited the Yates home and was so alarmed by Andrea's behavior that she told Rusty the children were not safe alone with their mother. Yet no immediate protective action was taken and Andrea was not hospitalized. 2 days later, on the morning of June 20, 2001, Rusty Yates left for work at NASA's Johnson Space Center as he did every weekday, leaving Andrea alone with all 5 children for the first time in months. What happened over the next hour would haunt the nation and spark intense debate about mental health treatment, religious extremism, and maternal responsibility. Andrea filled the family bathtub with water. Then one by one, she drowned her children, starting with 3-year-old Paul, then 2-year-old Luke, then 6-month-old Mary, whose body she left floating in the tub, while she chased down 7-year-old John and 5-year-old Noah, who had realized something was horribly wrong and tried to flee. John fought back, breaking free and running to the front door before Andrea caught him, dragged him back to the bathroom, and held him under the water until he stopped struggling. Noah, the eldest, begged his mother not to kill him, asking what he had done wrong. But Andrea drowned him too, then laid all 5 bodies side by side on her bed and covered them with a sheet. She called 911 at 9:48 a.m., telling dispatcher Doris Esmes in a disturbingly calm voice that she needed an officer and that her children were dead. When asked why, she replied simply, "I killed them." When Officer David Knapp arrived, he found Andrea standing in the doorway dripping wet, her arms crossed, and she immediately confessed, explaining that she had drowned each child individually because she was not a good mother and she wanted to save them from eternal damnation, believing that the only way to ensure their salvation was to kill them before they could sin and be corrupted by the world. The crime scene was meticulously documented by Houston police, with photographs showing the bathtub still full of water, wet footprints throughout the house, and the 5 small bodies arranged with eerie precision on the master bed, their faces peaceful as if sleeping. Andrea was taken to Harris County Jail while Rusty Yates collapsed at NASA upon receiving the news, and the case immediately captured national attention, with media coverage focusing on the apparent contradiction between Andrea's devoted motherhood and her methodical slaughter of her own children. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal, charged Andrea with capital murder, seeking the death penalty despite overwhelming evidence of severe mental illness, while her defense team, led by George Parnham and Wendell Odom, prepared an insanity defense based on Texas's modified Manhattan standard, which required proving that Andrea did not know her conduct was wrong due to a severe mental disease or defect. The first trial began on February 18, 2002, with jury selection taking nearly 3 weeks due to the case's notoriety, and the prosecution presented Andrea's calm demeanor in the 911 call, her organized behavior after the killings, and her statements to police as evidence that she knew what she was doing was illegal even if she believed it was morally right. The defense countered with testimony from multiple psychiatrists who had treated Andrea, including Dr. Philip Resnick, a nationally renowned forensic psychiatrist, who testified that Andrea suffered from severe postpartum psychosis with religious delusions, believing she was saving her children from Satan and that God would resurrect them after her execution, proving her complete break from reality. The prosecution's star witness was Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist who had consulted on the case and testified that Andrea did not meet the legal standard for insanity because she knew her actions were illegal, a distinction that became crucial when Dietz made a critical error on cross-examination, falsely stating that an episode of the television show Law and Order had featured a woman who drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity, when in fact no such episode existed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours on March 12, 2002, before finding Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder, and the following day, they rejected the insanity defense and sentenced her to life in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years. The conviction was overturned on appeal in 2005 when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals found that Dr. Dietz's false testimony about the Law and Order episode may have influenced the jury's decision, and Andrea was granted a new trial. The second trial began on July 26, 2006, with the same prosecutors but a different defense strategy that focused more heavily on Andrea's medical records and the failures of her treatment team. And on July 26, 2006, exactly 5 years after the drownings, a new jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity, committing her to the maximum security forensic psychiatric unit at Kerrville State Hospital, where she remains today. The case had profound implications for mental health law in Texas and nationwide, prompting changes in how postpartum psychiatric disorders are screened and treated, sparking debate about the intersection of religious belief and mental illness, and raising troubling questions about whether the mental health system failed Andrea Yates or whether her husband and family should have intervened more forcefully. Rusty Yates divorced Andrea in 2015, stating that he still loved her but needed to move forward, and he remarried the following year. Andrea continues to receive treatment at Kerrville, where she has reportedly stabilized on medication and participates in therapy, though she will likely remain institutionalized for the rest of her life. The Yates children were buried together at Forest Park East Cemetery in Webster, Texas, their gravestone inscribed with their names and the words faith, hope, love, and their deaths continue to be studied in medical schools, law schools, and psychology programs as a case study in the devastating potential of untreated postpartum psychosis and the complex legal questions surrounding maternal filicide. Number 2, Susan Smith, the drowning of 2 young sons in a South Carolina lake on October 25, 1994. A case that began as a frantic kidnapping report and ended in one of the most callous acts of maternal deception in criminal history. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, to Harry and Linda Vaughn in a fractured family marked by divorce, financial instability, and her father's eventual suicide when Susan was 6 years old, an event that would haunt her throughout her life and that she would later exploit for sympathy during her trial. She attended high school in Union, where she was described as popular and manipulative, with a pattern of relationships with older men and a reputation for dramatic attention-seeking behavior, including a false allegation of sexual assault against the stepfather of a boyfriend that was later recanted. In 1991, at age 19, Susan married David Smith, a young man she had met at a local grocery store, and the couple settled into married life in the small town of Union while both worked at the nearby Winn-Dixie distribution center. Their first son, Michael Daniel Smith, was born on October 10, 1991, and their second, Alexander Tyler Smith, followed on August 5, 1993, creating what appeared to be a young family building their future together. But beneath the surface, the marriage was strained by financial pressures, Susan's ongoing relationship with a former boyfriend, and her escalating affair with Tom Findlay, the son of a wealthy local businessman who represented everything Susan believed she deserved but did not have. By October 1994, Tom Findlay had written Susan a letter ending their affair, explicitly stating that he was not ready for a family and could not see a future with a woman who had children, a rejection that Susan received just days before she would report her sons missing. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith arrived at the sheriff's office in Union County and reported a carjacking, claiming that a black man had stopped her at a red light on Highway 49, forced his way into her burgundy Mazda protege at gunpoint, and driven off with 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex still strapped in their car seats, while she stood helpless on the roadside. Her performance was convincing enough to trigger immediate action, with law enforcement issuing an Amber Alert, the FBI joining the investigation, and national media descending on the small South Carolina town within hours. For 9 days, Susan Smith became the face of a grieving mother, making emotional televised pleas for the return of her babies, holding press conferences where she tearfully addressed the supposed kidnapper, and accepting comfort from a nation that watched her apparent suffering with collective heartbreak. David Smith, the boy's father, stood by Susan's side, equally convinced and equally devastated, and together they became symbols of parental anguish that transcended the usual boundaries of crime coverage. But behind closed doors, investigators were growing suspicious, noting inconsistencies in Susan's account, her failure to a polygraph examination, and the discovery that she had been in contact with Tom Findlay during the very time she claimed to be searching for her children. The crucial break came from FBI Special Agent Tommy Thomas, who confronted Susan on November 3, 1994, with evidence that her car had been found submerged in John D. Long Lake, approximately 12 miles from Union, with the bodies of Michael and Alex still strapped in their rear-facing car seats, drowned in 12 feet of water. Under intense questioning, Susan Smith confessed, admitting that she had rolled her car into the lake with her sons inside, hoping to kill them and then position herself as a tragic figure who could win back Tom Findlay without the burden of children he did not want. The confession was recorded, with Susan explaining in a flat, detached voice that she had planned the drowning for several days, that she had considered other methods of killing the boys, and that she had never intended to commit suicide as she had initially suggested, but rather to survive and benefit from the sympathy and attention their deaths would generate. The prosecution, led by Solicitor Tommy Pope, charged Susan with 2 counts of murder, seeking the death penalty based on the premeditation of her actions and the calculated deception that followed, while her defense team, led by David Bruck, argued that the deaths were the result of a botched suicide attempt and that Susan's confession was coerced and unreliable. The trial began on July 10, 1995, in the small courtroom of Union County, with jury selection taking nearly 2 weeks due to the case's extraordinary publicity, and the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Susan's motive, planning, and post-crime conduct, including testimony from Tom Findlay about his rejection letter, friends who described Susan's obsession with him, and forensic evidence showing that the car had been in neutral when it entered the water, indicating that Susan had exited before it submerged. The defense strategy focused on Susan's psychological state, with testimony from psychiatrist Dr. Seymour Halleck describing her as depressed, dependent, and capable of dissociation under stress, and from family members who recounted her father's suicide and her lifelong pattern of seeking male approval through whatever means necessary. The most powerful testimony came from David Smith, who took the stand against the wife he had initially believed and defended, describing the 9 days of hell they had endured together and his gradual realization that she had killed their sons, breaking down on the stand as he spoke of the memories he would never make with Michael and Alex and the future stolen from them by their mother's selfishness. The jury of 9 women and 3 men deliberated for less than 3 hours on July 28, 1995, before returning guilty verdicts on both counts of murder, and the following day, after hearing additional testimony in the penalty phase, they recommended life imprisonment rather than death, a decision that David Smith publicly accepted though he had privately hoped for execution. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, and she was transported to the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, where she has remained for nearly 3 decades. The case had lasting impact on missing children's protocols, with the 9-day search resulting in the implementation of more rigorous early investigation procedures for parental abduction claims. And it became a defining example of media manipulation in criminal cases, with Susan's televised performances studied in journalism and communications programs as a case study in how sympathy can be manufactured and exploited. Susan Smith has been denied parole twice, in 2015 and 2024, with the parole board citing the calculated nature of her crimes and her conduct in prison, which has included multiple disciplinary infractions for sexual relationships with prison guards and attempts to profit from her notoriety through documentary deals and paid interviews. Michael and Alex Smith are buried together at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Greenville, South Carolina, their grave marked by a small stone with their names and dates, and their father David has remarried, had additional children, and become an advocate for victims of violent crime, though he has stated that he will attend every parole hearing for Susan Smith to ensure that his sons are not forgotten and that their killer never walks free. Number 3. Diane Downs, the May 19, 1983 shooting of her 3 children on a dark Oregon road. A crime she blamed on a fictitious bushy-haired stranger while pursuing an affair with a man who did not want children. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, into a family that would later describe her as manipulative, narcissistic, and obsessed with being the center of attention from an early age, with a pattern of lying and manipulating others to achieve her desires. She married Steve Downs in 1973, a marriage that produced 3 children but ended in divorce in 1980 when Diane discovered Steve's infidelity, though friends would later note that Diane had been equally unfaithful throughout the marriage. Following the divorce, Diane became involved with a man named Lou Lewiston, but the relationship ended when she became pregnant with his child and he refused to commit to raising the baby, a rejection that seemed to trigger a determination in Diane to rid herself of the children who were interfering with her romantic prospects. In early 1983, Diane began an intense affair with Robert Knickerbocker, a married man who made clear that he could not be with her as long as she had children, and acquaintances would later testify that Diane became increasingly fixated on this relationship, speaking of desperate measures she might take to be with him. On the night of May 19, 1983, Diane Downs drove her 3 children into a rural area near Springfield, Oregon, stopped her car on a deserted road, and shot all 3 with a .22 caliber pistol, then shot herself in the left arm to stage an attack, before driving to Mackenzie Willamette Hospital with a fabricated story of a carjacking by a bushy-haired stranger. 7-year-old Cheryl Lynn was dead on arrival, having been shot at point-blank range in the chest, while 8-year-old Christy and 3-year-old Stephen Daniel were critically wounded with head and chest injuries that would leave Stephen paralyzed and Christy with permanent neurological damage. Diane's behavior at the hospital immediately raised suspicions among medical staff and the first responding officer, Deputy Bernie Whalen, who noted her strangely calm demeanor, her detailed and theatrical account of the supposed attack, and the fact that her gunshot wound appeared self-inflicted rather than defensive, with powder burns indicating the weapon had been held at arm's length rather than fired by an attacker. She also refused to provide information about Cheryl's condition, asking instead about a fictitious book she claimed to be writing, and made statements about wanting to see Robert Knickerbocker that seemed oddly prioritized over her children's survival. The investigation was led by Detective Doug Welch of the Lane County Sheriff's Office, who quickly uncovered Diane's affair with Knickerbocker and his clear statement that he would not leave his wife for a woman with children, establishing motive that Diane initially denied. Forensic analysis of the shooting scene revealed that the children had been shot while stationary in the car, not during a struggle as Diane claimed, and that the positions of the bullet wounds suggested execution-style killings rather than random shots fired during a carjacking. The most critical evidence came from Christy Downs, the sole surviving witness capable of testifying, who after months of recovery and intensive therapy, told investigators that her mother had shot all of them, a statement she would repeat at trial despite her severe speech impediment resulting from her injuries. Diane Downs was arrested on February 28, 1984, and charged with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, with the prosecution led by District Attorney Fred Hughey, who would later adopt the surviving children, and the defense led by Jim Jagger, who attempted to portray Diane as a victim of traumatic stress and a flawed investigation. The trial began on May 10, 1984, in the courthouse in Eugene, Oregon, and became a media sensation with national television coverage and packed galleries daily, as the public struggled to comprehend a mother who could shoot her own children to facilitate an affair. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence of staging, Diane's clear motive, her bizarre behavior after the shootings, and most powerfully, the videotaped testimony of Christy Downs, whose halting, laborious speech as she identified her mother as the shooter provided devastating evidence that the jury found credible despite defense attempts to discredit her as a confused and brain-damaged child. Diane took the stand in her own defense, maintaining her story of the bushy-haired stranger and offering complex, often contradictory explanations for her actions and statements, but her narcissistic performance alienated the jury, particularly when she smiled and flirted with the courtroom audience and seemed more concerned with her appearance than with the fate of her children. On June 17, 1984, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and Diane was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years, with the judge describing her crimes as among the most calculated and cruel he had encountered in his career. The case achieved renewed notoriety through in Rule's 1987 best-selling book Small Sacrifices, which provided exhaustive detail about the investigation and trial, and a subsequent television movie starring Farrah Fawcett as Diane Downs, cementing the case in American true crime consciousness. Diane escaped from prison in 1987 but was recaptured within days, resulting in additional charges and transfer to the more secure California Institution for Women, and she has been denied parole multiple times, most recently in 2024, with parole boards citing her continued lack of remorse and responsibility for her crimes. Christy and Danny Downs were adopted by prosecutor Fred Hughey and his wife Joann, who raised them as their own children, with Christy eventually becoming a teacher and mother and Danny working as a computer specialist despite his physical limitations, while Cheryl is buried in a cemetery in Springfield, her grave tended by the Hughey family. Diane Downs continues to maintain her innocence, has given multiple interviews claiming a conspiracy against her, and has become a subject of continued fascination for true crime researchers studying narcissistic personality disorder and maternal filicide, her case representing perhaps the purest example of a mother who viewed her children as obstacles to be eliminated rather than lives to be cherished. Number 4. Mary Beth Tinning, the systematic murder of 9 children over 14 years in Schenectady, New York, a case that exposed catastrophic failures in pediatric death investigation and a mother's ability to exploit medical sympathy. Mary Beth Rowe was born on September 11, 1942, in Duanesburg, New York, the daughter of a press operator and a homemaker in a working-class family that provided little emotional warmth or attention, and she would later describe a childhood marked by neglect and a desperate need to be noticed that would shape her entire adult life. She married Joseph Tinning in 1965, and their first child, Barbara, was born in 1967, followed by Joseph Jr. in 1972. But it was the death of these first 2 children that would establish a pattern that Mary Beth would repeat with horrifying consistency over the next 14 years. Barbara died at 4 months old in 1967, officially attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, and Joseph Jr. died at 2 weeks old in 1972, also attributed to SIDS, deaths that generated community sympathy rather than suspicion and established Mary Beth as a tragic figure who had suffered unbearable loss. The Tinnings' third child, Jennifer, was born in 1972 but was already sick with meningitis, dying at 8 days old from what was determined to be a natural cause unrelated to her mother's actions. Yet this death too fed the narrative of Mary Beth as a mother beset by cruel fate. What followed was the birth and death of 6 more Tinning children, each dying in infancy or early childhood under circumstances that should have triggered intensive investigation, but instead generated only repeated expressions of sorrow for Mary Beth's apparent bad luck. John died in 1973 at 5 months, officially SIDS. Nathan died in 1975 at 5 months, officially SIDS. Mary Frances died in 1978 at 5 months, officially SIDS. Jonathan died in 1979 at 4 months, officially SIDS. Michael died in 1981 at 3.5 months, officially SIDS, and Tammy Lynn, the 9th child, died in 1985 at 4 months, this time with Mary Beth bringing a blue, lifeless baby to the hospital and claiming to have found her that way in her crib. The deaths occurred across multiple hospitals and jurisdictions, with different physicians signing death certificates and no systematic review connecting the extraordinary cluster of fatalities in a single family, a failure that would later prompt complete revision of pediatric death investigation protocols nationwide. Mary Beth's behavior at the deaths was consistently theatrical, with witnesses describing her as dramatically grief-stricken at hospitals and funeral homes, yet immediately seeking attention and sympathy from anyone who would provide it. And she became well known in Schenectady as the unfortunate mother who had buried 9 children, receiving community support, charitable donations, and even a slot on the Phil Donahue Show where she discussed her losses with apparently genuine emotion. The turning point came with Tammy Lynn's death on December 20, 1985, when Schenectady Police Detective William Barnes, assigned to review the case file, discovered the pattern of previous deaths and requested exhumation and autopsy of several Tinning children, finding evidence of asphyxiation in Mary Frances and Jonathan that contradicted their original SIDS determinations. Investigators also uncovered Mary Beth's history of attention-seeking behavior, her statements to friends about wanting another baby to replace the one she had lost, and crucially, her admissions to hospital personnel on multiple occasions that she had smothered her children, statements that had been dismissed as attention-seeking or delusional rather than investigated as confessions. Mary Beth was arrested on February 4, 1986, and charged with the murders of Mary Frances, Nathan, and Tammy Lynn, with prosecutors acknowledging that charges in the other deaths were precluded by lack of evidence, although they believed she had killed all 9 children. Her trial began on June 22, 1987, in Schenectady County Court, with the prosecution led by Chief Assistant District Attorney John Porsche and the defense by former District Attorney Thomas Spargo, and the central challenge for prosecutors was proving murder without forensic evidence in most cases, and against a defendant who inspired significant community sympathy. The prosecution strategy focused on demonstrating the statistical impossibility of 9 SIDS deaths in one family, presenting testimony from pediatric forensic experts who explained that the recurrence rate for genuine SIDS was extremely low and that the Tinning pattern was consistent with suffocation, and introducing Mary Beth's own admissions and her bizarre behavior as evidence of guilt. The defense countered with testimony from SIDS researchers who, at that time, still believed that familial clustering could occur, and who suggested that genetic or environmental factors in the Tinning home might explain the deaths, while also emphasizing the lack of direct evidence linking Mary Beth to any specific killing. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of second-degree murder on July 17, 1987, and Mary Beth was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, a relatively lenient sentence by contemporary standards that reflected the difficulty of the prosecution case and lingering uncertainty about some of the deaths. The Tinning case had profound impact on pediatric medicine and child protection, leading to the development of formal protocols for investigating multiple infant deaths in single families, mandatory reporting requirements, and the establishment of child death review teams in most states, with Mary Beth's name becoming synonymous with the dangers of medical assumptions about maternal grief. She has been denied parole 6 times, most recently in 2023, with the parole board citing her continued minimization of her crimes and lack of insight into her motivations. And she remains incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, while Joseph Tinning divorced her in 2017 after maintaining his belief in her innocence for decades. The surviving Tinning children are memorialized in a single grave at Most Holy Redeemer Cemetery in Niskayuna, New York, and their case continues to be studied in medical and criminal justice programs as a landmark example of how systematic medical murder can evade detection when it exploits social expectations about motherhood and grief. Number 5. Deborah Milke. The December 2, 1989 conspiracy to murder her 4-year-old son Christopher in Phoenix, Arizona, a case built on a disputed confession and decades of legal controversy. Deborah Jean Milke was born on March 10, 1964, in Germany to an American military family, spending her childhood in various locations before settling in Arizona, where she worked as an insurance clerk and raised her son Christopher Conan Milke, born in 1985, as a single mother after separating from the child's father. By 1989, Deborah was involved with a man named Jim Stiers, who shared her apartment and helped care for Christopher, though the relationship was reportedly strained and Deborah had expressed to friends that she found motherhood burdensome and wished to be free of its responsibilities. On the morning of December 2, 1989, Deborah dressed Christopher in his favorite outfit, told him he was going to see Santa Claus at the mall, and sent him off with Jim Stiers and another man, Roger Scott, while she remained at the apartment and later ran errands including purchasing ABBA tickets for an upcoming concert. Stiers and Scott drove Christopher to a desert wash north of Phoenix, where the 4-year-old was told to wait while the men walked away, Then one of them returned and shot him 3 times in the head, leaving his body to be discovered days later by a man searching for his lost eyeglasses. The investigation initially focused on Stiers and Scott, with Roger Scott eventually confessing to police and implicating Stiers, but also claiming that Deborah Milke had been involved in planning the murder, motivated by a $5,000 life insurance policy on Christopher and her desire to be free of parental obligations. The critical evidence against Deborah came from Phoenix Police Detective Armando Saldate, who claimed that Deborah had confessed to him in a 30-minute interrogation conducted without recording, witnesses, or signed documentation, during which he alleged she broke down crying and admitted to arranging Christopher's murder because she hated him, wanted the insurance money, and preferred to spend her income on herself rather than on her son's care. Deborah consistently denied making any confession, stating that Saldate had fabricated the statement and that she had requested an attorney immediately upon being taken into custody, a request she claimed he ignored while continuing to question her in isolation. She was arrested on December 14, 1989, and charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, child abuse, and kidnapping, with the prosecution led by Deputy County Attorney Noel Levy and the defense by Attorney Alan Tavasoli, and her trial began on January 23, 1991, in Maricopa County Superior Court. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Detective Saldate's testimony about the confession, supplemented by evidence of the insurance policy, Deborah's statements to friends about not wanting to be a mother, and her apparently calm demeanor after Christopher's disappearance, which investigators interpreted as suspicious rather than as possible shock or dissociation. The defense attacked Saldate's credibility, presenting evidence that he had been previously disciplined for lying in official reports, that he had a pattern of extracting disputed confessions, and that no corroborating evidence existed for Deborah's alleged admission, while also providing alternative explanations for her behavior and the insurance policy that was standard for many working parents. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on February 4, 1991, and Judge Ron Reinstein sentenced Deborah to death, making her one of only a few women on Arizona's death row and subjecting her to decades of solitary confinement in the women's unit at Perryville Prison. The case became a cause célèbre for innocence advocates, with the Arizona Justice Project taking on Deborah's case and uncovering extensive evidence of Detective Saldate's misconduct, including multiple instances where he had been found to have lied under oath, violated suspects' rights, and fabricated confessions in other cases, evidence that had never been disclosed to Deborah's original defense team. In March 2013, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned Deborah's convictions, finding that the prosecution had committed Brady violations by withholding Saldate's disciplinary record and that his testimony was not credible given this pattern of dishonesty, ordering that she be released unless the state chose to retry her within a reasonable time. Prosecutors declined to retry Deborah Milke, citing the passage of time, unavailable witnesses, and the compromised nature of their central evidence, and she was released from custody on September 6, 2013, after nearly 24 years in prison, 10 of them on death row. Deborah filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit against Maricopa County and various officials, eventually settling for $3 million in 2018, while simultaneously pursuing murder charges against her through civil litigation that was ultimately dismissed. Jim Stiers was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment. Roger Scott received a life sentence and died in prison in 2016. The Milke case remains deeply controversial, with some observers convinced of Deborah's guilt based on circumstantial evidence and her associations, while others view her as a victim of police misconduct and prosecutorial overreach, with the disputed confession representing a fundamental failure of criminal justice safeguards. Detective Armando Saldate invoked his Fifth Amendment rights when called to testify about his conduct and retired from the police department without facing criminal charges, though his record has been extensively cited in debates about police accountability and the dangers of uncorroborated confession evidence. Christopher Milke is buried at Rest Haven Park West Cemetery in Glendale, Arizona, and his case continues to be studied in law schools as an example of how death penalty convictions can rest on fragile evidence, and how decades of legal process may be required to correct potential wrongful convictions, with Debra Milke now living in Arizona and Germany, maintaining her innocence in occasional interviews while largely avoiding public attention. Number 6. Darlie Routier, the June 6, 1996 stabbing murders of her 2 young sons in Rowlett, Texas. a case that divided public opinion with its competing narratives of maternal savagery and intruder violence. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a working-class family who moved to Lubbock, Texas during her childhood, where she developed interests in modeling, cheerleading, and eventually cosmetology, training to become a dental assistant and establishing herself as an attractive, outgoing young woman with ambitions beyond her circumstances. She married Darren Routier in 1988, when she was 18 and he was 20, and the couple had 3 sons: Devin, born in 1989, Damon, born in 1991, and Drake, born in 1995, while building a successful business in gemstones and living in an upscale home in the Dallas suburb of Rowlett that they had carefully designed and decorated. By 1996, however, the Routiers faced significant financial pressure, with their business struggling and their lavish lifestyle becoming unsustainable, and Darlie was reportedly experiencing depression, weight gain, and dissatisfaction with her life as a suburban mother, expressing to friends that she felt trapped and unfulfilled. On the night of June 6, 1996, Darlie Routier called 911 at 2:31 a.m., reporting that an intruder had broken into her home and attacked her and her children, screaming that her boys were dead and that she had fought with the attacker before he fled through the garage. Police arrived to find a scene of extraordinary violence. 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon had been fatally stabbed with a kitchen knife from the Routier home, with Devin dead in the living room and Damon barely alive but dying from his wounds within minutes. 7-month-old Drake was unharmed upstairs, and Darlie herself had a slashed throat and defensive wounds on her arms that she claimed resulted from fighting with the intruder. The initial investigation treated the case as a home invasion, but suspicion quickly focused on Darlie due to multiple inconsistencies in her account, forensic evidence that suggested staging, and behavior that investigators and prosecutors interpreted as inconsistent with maternal grief and more consistent with guilt. Critical evidence included blood spatter patterns indicating that Darlie had stood over Devin while he bled rather than rendering aid, the positioning of a bloodied knife on the kitchen counter that suggested it had been placed rather than dropped, and the famous silly string video showing Darlie giggling and spraying silly string on her son's graves during a graveside birthday party for Devin just 11 days after the murders, a video that would become central to public perception of her guilt. Investigators also noted that the window screen supposedly cut by the intruder had been cut from the inside, that bloody footprints in the house matched Darlie's own, and that her wounds, while serious enough to require surgery, were superficial compared to the fatal injuries inflicted on her sons and appeared possibly self-inflicted. Darlie was arrested on June 18, 1996, and charged with capital murder, with the prosecution led by Greg Davis and Toby Shook and the defense led by Douglas Mulder and Richard Mosty, and her trial began on January 6, 1997, in the Kerrville courtroom of Judge Mark Tolley, moved from Dallas due to pretrial publicity. The prosecution presented an extensive forensic case arguing that Darlie had committed the murders in a rage or dissociative state, then staged the intruder scenario, with testimony from blood spatter experts, crime scene analysts, and psychologists who described her as narcissistic, materialistic, and capable of violence when her self-image was threatened. The defense countered with alternative theories of an actual intruder, pointing to an unidentified bloody fingerprint on the glass table, a bloody sock found several houses away that did not match Darlie or the children, and questions about whether the timeline allowed Darlie to commit the murders, stage the scene, and inflict her own wounds before calling 911. The jury deliberated for 10 hours before returning guilty verdicts on February 1, 1997, and after the penalty phase in which the silly string video was played repeatedly, they sentenced Darlie to death by lethal injection. The Routier case became one of the most debated in modern true crime, with television programs, books, and websites divided between those convinced of Darlie's guilt and those believing in her innocence, with the latter group citing concerns about trial errors, withheld evidence, and alternative suspect theories including the possibility that Darren Routier was involved or that an actual intruder had been overlooked. Multiple appeals have failed, with courts finding that none of the alleged new evidence, including DNA testing results, established actual innocence or undermined confidence in the verdict, though Darlie's supporters continue to litigate and advocate for her release. She remains on death row at the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas, one of only a handful of women awaiting execution in the state, while Darren Routier divorced her in 2011, maintains her innocence, and has raised their surviving son Drake, now an adult, while participating in documentaries and investigations into the case. Devin and Damon Routier are buried together at Rest Haven Memorial Park in Rockwall, Texas, and their murders continue to generate intense public interest, with recent documentary series revisiting the evidence and reigniting debate about whether Darlie Routier is a monster who killed her children or a victim of Arush to judgment and flawed forensic science. Number 7. Megan Huntsman. The systematic murder of 6 newborns between 1996 and 2006 in Pleasant Grove, Utah. A case of hidden pregnancy and secret infanticide that shocked a close-knit Mormon community. Megan Michelle Huntsman was born on August 27, 1975, in Pleasant Grove, Utah, a small city in Utah County dominated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where she was raised in a devout Mormon family that emphasized traditional values, large families, and community reputation. Above all else, she married Darren West in 1993, when she was 18, and the couple had 3 daughters together while establishing themselves as a typical young family in a community where appearance and conformity carried significant social weight. What no one knew, including her husband for most of this period, was that Megan had become pregnant 6 additional times between 1996 and 2006, concealing each pregnancy through baggy clothing, isolation, and denial, then giving birth alone in her home and immediately killing the newborns to hide their existence from her family and community. The method was consistent across all 6 cases. Megan would give birth in secret, usually in the bathroom or bedroom, then suffocate the infant or strangle it with her bare hands, wrap the body in cloth or plastic, and hide it in cardboard boxes that she stored in the garage of their modest home, sometimes placing air fresheners or other materials to mask any odor. She told no one of these births or deaths, maintaining her public persona as a mother of 3, and her husband Darren, who struggled with drug addiction and was frequently absent or incarcerated during this period, remained unaware of the hidden children despite living in the same house. The secret began to unravel on April 12, 2014, when Darren West, recently released from prison and attempting to reconcile with Megan, was helping their eldest daughter move out of the family home and discovered a dead infant wrapped in plastic while moving boxes in the garage. He called 911, and Pleasant Grove police responded to find not 1 but 7 infant bodies in various states of decomposition, with Megan immediately confessing that she had given birth to and killed 6 of them over a decade, while the 7th appeared to have been stillborn. The confession was detailed and matter-of-fact, with Megan explaining that she had been addicted to methamphetamine throughout most of this period, that she did not want anyone to know she was pregnant, and that she killed the infants because she could not care for them and could not bear the shame of their existence in a community that valued maternal purity and large families. She was arrested and charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, with the 7th death not charged due to uncertainty about whether the infant was born alive, and the case immediately attracted national attention as an extreme example of denial pregnancy and neonaticide hidden within an apparently normal suburban family. The investigation revealed that Megan had successfully concealed her pregnancies through a combination of obesity, loose clothing, and social isolation, that she had given birth without medical assistance in all cases, and that no one in her family or community had suspected her condition despite obvious physical changes that should have been noticeable. The prosecution, led by Utah County Attorney Jeff Booman, faced significant challenges in building a case given the degraded state of the remains, which prevented definitive determination of cause of death for several infants, and the decision to charge first-degree murder rather than lesser offenses that might have been easier to prove but carried lighter sentences. Megan's trial was avoided when she agreed to plead guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder on February 12, 2015, in exchange for 6 consecutive sentences of 15 years to life, a plea arrangement that guaranteed she would serve at least 30 years before parole eligibility and likely remain incarcerated for life given the number of victims and the nature of her crimes. At sentencing, Judge Darryl McDade described Megan's actions as among the most disturbing he had encountered, noting the repeated, calculated nature of the killings and the complete absence of any attempt to seek help or alternatives to murder, while also acknowledging the role of her addiction and mental health issues in enabling her denial and dissociation. The Huntsman case prompted significant discussion about denial pregnancy, a recognized but poorly understood phenomenon in which women conceal or fail to acknowledge pregnancy until delivery, and about the pressures facing women in conservative religious communities where unwed pregnancy or large families outside marriage carry severe social stigma. It also highlighted failures in substance abuse treatment and family support systems, as Megan's methamphetamine addiction was known to some family members but never addressed through intervention or professional help that might have uncovered her secret. Darren West has stated that he had no knowledge of the hidden pregnancies or killings, and he has worked to rebuild relationships with the 3 surviving daughters while processing the revelation that his wife had murdered 6 of his children without his knowledge. The infant victims were buried together in a private ceremony, their graves unmarked at family request, and their case continues to be studied in maternal fetal medicine, psychology, and criminal justice programs as an extreme example of how social pressure, addiction, and psychological denial can combine to produce repeated acts of concealed infanticide over many years. Number 8. Lacey Spears, the January 2014 poisoning death of her 5-year-old son Garnett through systematic salt administration. A case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy that developed over years of medical child abuse documented on social media. Lacey Ellen Spears was born on February 3, 1989, in Decatur, Alabama, and raised in a troubled family environment that included her parents' divorce, financial instability, and reports of her own mother's unusual attention-seeking behavior that may have modeled the patterns Lacey would later replicate with her own child. From an early age, Lacey was drawn to caregiving roles, working as a nanny and in elder care before becoming pregnant at age 18 with her son Garnett Paul Thompson Spears. Born on December 3, 2009, after a relationship with a man who was not involved in the child's upbringing. Garnett's medical history immediately became complex, with Lacey reporting feeding difficulties, failure to thrive, and various symptoms that generated extensive medical attention beginning in his first months of life. And over the next 4 years, Garnett would be hospitalized more than 20 times, undergo numerous unnecessary procedures, and be subjected to a feeding tube insertion that Lacey appeared to manipulate and exploit for attention and sympathy. What medical professionals did not recognize, and what would only become clear in retrospect, was that Lacey was likely inducing many of Garnett's symptoms through deliberate medical child abuse, a condition known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a dependent to assume the sick role by proxy and receive the attention and sympathy associated with caring for a critically ill child. Lacey's behavior fit the classic pattern. She was constantly at Garnett's side during hospitalizations, creating close relationships with nurses and doctors, questioning and sometimes contradicting medical advice, and maintaining an extensive social media presence where she documented Garnett's struggles with posts, photographs, and appeals for prayers and support that generated thousands of followers and significant emotional engagement. In 2013, Lacey and Garnett moved into a communal living facility called Fellowship Community in Chestnut Ridge, New York, a decision that placed them in close proximity to other families and caregivers who would later provide crucial testimony about Lacey's behavior, including observations that she sometimes withheld food from Garnett, seemed to enjoy the attention his condition generated, and had an unusual fascination with his feeding tube and medical equipment. The fatal sequence began on January 17, 2014, when Garnett was admitted to Nyack Hospital with severe seizures, elevated sodium levels, and neurological symptoms that rapidly progressed despite treatment, leading to his transfer to Westchester Medical Center where he died on January 23, 2014, with a final sodium level of 182 milliequivalents/L, nearly double the normal range and consistent with acute salt poisoning. The medical response to Garnett's death initially treated it as a tragic complication of his complex medical history, but nurses at Fellowship Community had already become suspicious of Lacey, with one, Brenda Burrell, having observed her administering something through Garnett's feeding tube on the morning of his hospitalization and preserving the bag as potential evidence. Investigators also discovered Lacey's extensive internet search history, which included queries about salt poisoning, what happens to sodium levels, and whether feeding tubes could be detected in autopsy, searches that demonstrated knowledge and intent inconsistent with her public persona as a devoted mother seeking only to help her son. Lacey was arrested on June 17, 2014, and charged with second-degree depraved indifference murder and first-degree manslaughter, with the prosecution led by Assistant District Attorney Patricia Murphy and Doreen Lloyd and the defense led by Stephen Riebling, and her trial began on February 3, 2015, in the Westchester County Courthouse before Judge Robert Neary. The prosecution presented an exhaustive case documenting years of medical child abuse, with testimony from pediatric specialists who explained how Lacey's actions had caused Garnett's death through deliberate sodium administration, from nurses who described their suspicions and observations, and from computer forensic experts who detailed her incriminating internet searches. The defense attempted to portray Lacey as a caring mother overwhelmed by a genuinely sick child, suggesting that Garnett's death resulted from his complex medical conditions rather than deliberate poisoning, and calling expert witnesses who questioned whether the sodium levels could have been intentionally induced. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning guilty verdicts on both counts on April 14, 2015, and Judge Neary sentenced Lacey to 20 years to life in prison, describing her conduct as a calculated, sustained campaign of abuse that culminated in her son's murder. The Spears case became a landmark in the understanding of Munchausen syndrome by proxy in the social media age, with researchers noting how Lacey's online documentation of Garnett's illness provided both a motive for continued abuse and a record that ultimately helped prove her guilt, and prompting discussions about the responsibilities of social media platforms and online communities in recognizing and reporting potential medical child abuse. Lacey Spears is incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, has maintained her innocence in appeals that have been denied, and shows little insight into her psychological condition in available records, while Garnett's father Chris Hill has spoken publicly about his grief and his unsuccessful attempts to establish a relationship with his son during his short life. Garnett is buried in a cemetery in Alabama near Lacey's family, and his case continues to be studied in child protection, medical education, and psychology programs as a tragic example of how Munchausen syndrome by proxy can evade detection for years when it exploits medical complexity and social media sympathy, with his photograph still appearing in presentations about medical child abuse warning signs. Number 9. Joann Cunningham. The April 2019 beating death of her 5-year-old son Andrew A.J. Freund in Crystal Lake, Illinois, a case of chronic abuse culminating in murder and elaborate concealment that exposed systematic failures in child protective services. Joann Christine Cunningham was born on September 12, 1987, in Crystal Lake, Illinois, into a family with its own history of instability and substance abuse, and she struggled from adolescence with heroin addiction, mental health issues, and a pattern of relationships with abusive men that would characterize her adult life. She met Andrew Freund Sr., a lawyer, in 2012, and the couple had a son, Andrew A.J. Freund Jr., on October 14, 2013, though their relationship was marked by domestic violence, drug use, and multiple interventions by Child Protective Services that failed to remove A.J. from the home despite clear evidence of danger. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services first became involved with the Freund family in 2015, when A.J., then 16 months old, was found wandering unattended in a parking lot, leading to a neglect investigation that resulted in services but no removal. And this pattern would repeat over the next 4 years with multiple hotline calls documenting bruises, injuries, and concerning behavior that never resulted in permanent protective action. In 2018, Joann was arrested for aggravated battery after A.J. was found with extensive bruising and a laceration to his lip, but she pled guilty to misdemeanor battery, received probation, and A.J. remained in her custody with ongoing DCFS monitoring that proved inadequate to protect him from escalating violence. The events of April 2019 remain partially disputed, but investigators established that Joann became enraged at A.J. for an unspecified infraction, forced him into a cold shower for an extended period as punishment, then beat him so severely that he died from craniocerebral trauma, after which she and Andrew Freund Sr. concealed his body for approximately 6 days while maintaining the fiction that he was missing. The concealment was elaborate and calculated. They placed A.J.'s body in a plastic container, stored it in the basement of their home, filed a false missing person report claiming A.J. had disappeared from his bed overnight, and participated in extensive community searches and media appeals while knowing their son was dead and hidden in their own house. The deception unraveled when investigators, skeptical of the parents' accounts from the outset, obtained cell phone data showing Andrew Freund Sr. had traveled to a remote location in Woodstock, Illinois, on the day A.J. was supposedly discovered missing, leading to his confession and the recovery of A.J.'s badly decomposed body from a shallow grave on April 24, 2019, 50 miles from the family home. Both parents were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated battery, and concealment of a homicidal death, with Joann Cunningham facing separate proceedings from Andrew Freund Sr., who eventually pled guilty and testified against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. Joann's trial was avoided when she agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder on December 5, 2019, in a deal that prosecutors arranged to spare AJ's siblings, including an infant born while Joann was in custody, from testifying against their mother, and she was sentenced to 35 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the horror of her crime and the recognition that she had been subjected to domestic violence and manipulation by Andrew Freund Sr. The case generated intense scrutiny of Illinois DCFS, with investigations revealing that caseworkers had missed or minimized multiple warning signs, that supervisory failures had allowed AJ to remain in a home where he was clearly unsafe, and that systemic understaffing and high turnover had compromised the agency's ability to protect vulnerable children. AJ Freund became a symbol of child protective failure, with his photograph appearing in legislative hearings, policy reports, and media coverage that demanded reform of the systems that had failed to save him despite years of documented danger. Joann Cunningham is incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where she has reportedly struggled with mental health issues and the consequences of her addiction, while Andrew Freund Sr. is serving a 14-year sentence at Stateville Correctional Center and has expressed remorse for his role in the concealment and murder. AJ is buried at St. Michael the Archangel Catholic Cemetery in Palatine, Illinois, his grave marked by a stone with his photograph and the words, "Forever in our hearts." And his case continues to drive reform efforts in Illinois child welfare, with new laws and procedures named in his memory and ongoing debate about how to balance family preservation with child safety in cases of chronic abuse. Number 10, Casey Anthony, the June 16, 2008 death of her 2-year-old daughter Kaylee Marie Anthony in Orlando, Florida. A case of alleged murder that became a defining media spectacle and one of the most controversial acquittals in American legal history. Kaylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9, 2005, in Orlando, Florida, to Casey Marie Anthony and her boyfriend Jesse Grund, though Casey retained primary custody and raised Kaylee with extensive support from her parents George and Cindy Anthony in their suburban Orlando home, creating what appeared to be a close 3-generation family unit. Casey Anthony was born on March 19, 1986, in Warren, Ohio, the daughter of a former police officer and a nurse, and was described throughout her adolescence and early adulthood as outgoing, attractive, and prone to fabrication, with a documented pattern of lying about employment, education, and circumstances that would become central to understanding her behavior after Kaylee's disappearance. In 2008, Casey was ostensibly working at Universal Studios as an event planner, living with her parents and daughter, and maintaining an active social life that included a new boyfriend and frequent outings to nightclubs, though in reality she had been fired from Universal Studios years earlier and was sustaining her lifestyle through theft from family and friends while her parents believed she was employed and Kaylee was with a nanny. On June 16, 2008, Casey Anthony left her parents' home with Kaylee and did not return, though she maintained telephone contact with her family and continued her social activities without apparent concern for her daughter's whereabouts, behavior that would not trigger alarm for more than a month. On July 15, 2008, Cindy Anthony called 911, reporting that Casey had admitted that Kaylee was missing and that she had been searching for her for a month without contacting authorities, a revelation that immediately generated intense law enforcement response and media attention that would continue for 3 years. Casey's initial statements to police were contradictory and implausible, claiming that she had left Kaylee with a nanny named Zenaida Zani Fernandez Gonzalez and that both had disappeared, a story that investigators quickly determined was fabricated, with no evidence of such a person existing and multiple witnesses placing Casey at nightclubs and parties during the period she claimed to be searching for her daughter. The investigation revealed that Casey's car had been towed from an apartment complex parking lot on June 30, 2008, with neighbors reporting a foul odor consistent with decomposition, and that Casey had stolen her friend Amy Heisinga's checkbook and car, transported unidentified materials in her vehicle, and conducted internet searches for chloroform, how to make chloroform, neck breaking, and household weapons in the days before Kaylee's last known appearance. Casey was arrested on July 16, 2008, and charged with child neglect, false statements, and obstruction, with charges escalating as the investigation continued and remains were not immediately found, and she remained incarcerated for the next 3 years as the case developed into one of the most heavily publicized criminal prosecutions in American history. Kaylee's remains were discovered on December 11, 2008, by utility worker Roy Kronk in wooded area near the Anthony home, with the body so decomposed that cause of death could not be definitively determined, though the skeletal remains showed evidence of duct tape positioned near the mouth and nose, suggesting possible asphyxiation or concealment. The prosecution, led by Linda Drain Burdick, Jeff Ashton, and Frank George, charged Casey with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter, and 4 counts of lying to law enforcement, building a circumstantial case based on the decomposition evidence, the internet searches, Casey's behavior after Kaylee's disappearance, and forensic analysis of hair and air samples from her car that indicated decomposition. The defense, led by Jose Baez, presented an alternative theory of accidental drowning, claiming that Kaylee had drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008, that George Anthony had discovered the body and concealed it with Casey's knowledge, and that Casey's subsequent lies and behavior resulted from traumatic dissociation and years of sexual abuse by her father, allegations that George Anthony vehemently denied and for which no corroborating evidence was presented. The trial began on May 24, 2011, in the Orange County Courthouse, with jury selection taking 11 days and the trial lasting 6 weeks, generating constant media coverage, daily courtroom broadcasts, and intense public engagement that divided observers between those convinced of Casey's guilt and those troubled by the lack of direct evidence or definitive cause of death. The prosecution presented its forensic case, including controversial testimony from Dr. Arpad Vass about odor analysis and from FBI experts about hair banding consistent with decomposition, while the defense attacked each piece of evidence as unreliable, unscientific, or consistent with accidental death rather than murder. The most dramatic testimony came from George Anthony, who denied all allegations of abuse or involvement in Kaylee's death, and from Casey herself, who chose not to testify, leaving the jury to evaluate her guilt based on evidence rather than her explanations. The jury deliberated for less than 11 hours on July 5, 2011, before returning not guilty verdicts on all major charges, convicting Casey only of the 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to law enforcement, a verdict that generated immediate public outrage, media condemnation, and widespread belief that justice had failed Kaylee Anthony. Jurors later explained that they found the prosecution had not proven cause of death or established premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt, with some expressing belief that Casey knew more than she revealed, but that the state's case was insufficient for conviction. Casey was sentenced to time served for the misdemeanor convictions and released on July 17, 2011, returning to a life of infamy that has included bankruptcy, multiple civil lawsuits, efforts to profit from her notoriety through paid interviews and documentary appearances, and ongoing public vilification that has made normal employment and relationships impossible. The Anthony case has been extensively analyzed for its implications for media coverage of criminal trials, with studies suggesting that pretrial publicity and the narrative of the most hated woman in America may have influenced public perception without affecting the jury's evidence-based evaluation, and for its demonstration of how circumstantial murder cases without cause of death determination face significant evidentiary challenges. It also prompted debate about double jeopardy protections, with multiple legislative proposals for Kaylee's Law criminalizing failure to report missing children that have been enacted in several states. George and Cindy Anthony divorced and remarried each other, have given conflicting accounts of their belief in their daughter's innocence, and continue to reside in Florida, while Casey Anthony lives in an undisclosed location, maintains limited contact with her parents, and has a daughter born in 2022 whose existence was revealed only through private investigation. Kaylee Marie Anthony is buried at Woodlawn Memorial Park in Gotha, Florida, her grave marked by a small stone visited by strangers who leave toys and flowers, and her case remains unresolved in the public mind, with ongoing speculation about what truly happened to her and whether her mother murdered her, enabled her death through neglect, or was somehow innocent of the worst accusations while clearly responsible for the lies and concealment that followed.